In the first episode of the series, we went through the cockpit assembly, detailing, painting and weathering. In today's episode, the parts will come together and will look much more like the airplane we know and love. This video comes to you in cooperation with DN Models, DACO Products, Elegoo and PCBWay. Let's continue the work with the nose gear bay. The kit provides a respectable amount of surface features and details. But, as you know very well, more is more. Once again, the DACO book allowed me access inside the nooks and crannies of the airplane, and I was able to source ideas for several upgrades. Here I used a variety of materials like soldering wire, copper wire, stretch sprue, plastic rods, 3D printed connectors, and whatever I found useful from a box full of gribblies. Some of those I glued in place using plastic cement, and for others I used thin CI glue. Every now and then I did dry fit tests to see whether or not the additional details would jeopardize the fit, and did corrections where that was necessary. There were a couple of injector pin marks that I had to fill and then sand. There were others that I left alone, hoping they will not be visible once the nose gear bay is assembled. How this will work out, we shall see later on. As it can be expected from Tamiya, the assembly of the original parts was top notch. Everything slots on where it needs to be without any issues. Fortunately enough, the additional details did not make the assembly any more difficult. Here I want to say thank you to all my supporters over at Patreon and on the YouTube membership program. You guys are amazing! After I removed some more necessary components from the sprues, I applied a good layer or two of Mr. Surfacer 1500 black primer. That was followed by insignia white in the gear bay and on the afterburner dome. Not trying to cover everything in the gear bay left some nice shadows. The afterburner duct assembly I painted in green. Unfortunately, I cannot recall what color I used for this task. The flame holder rings I painted in flat aluminum. To do some weathering on the afterburner domes, I used a sponge with which I applied several rusty brown colors. Very simple yet quite effective method. To start the weathering of the afterburner ducts, I first did a dry brushing with buff oil paint. That put an emphasis on the edges as well as on the top areas of the curved surfaces. I gave this layer some time to cure and then I applied a Starship Field wash. I used a more intense version on the panel overlap lines, and then I diluted the wash further to apply it liberally all over the surface. That was done of course after the first wash was dry. After the excess was removed, I went ahead to assemble the afterburner section. You know the theme of this build already, but let me say it one more time. It all fits perfectly. After all was in place, it quickly became obvious that things are not going to be obvious at all. But at least you and I will know what is in there. Moving on to the nose gear bay weathering. Starting with snow white oil paint, I dry brushed the entire bay. There is a very small difference between insignia white and snow white, but it is there and it is better than nothing. Next, I did some detail painting, which morphed into paint distress using a brush. This is a technique that I still fail to master, but I hope it will happen one day. To represent hose clamps, I used strips of a chrome sheet from Ammo by MiG. Those removed themselves not long after the application for some reason. After a layer of gloss varnish, I applied the familiar Starship Field oil paint wash. The excess was carefully removed with the help of a fine brush and some white spirit. Before we go any further, let me tell you about the sponsor of today's video. PCBWay offers professional on-demand 3D printing service. They can print your projects in plastic, resin or even metal. They also offer sheet metal and carbon fiber fabrication, CNC machining in a huge array of materials, injection molding and many electronic component solutions. Check them out, link I will leave in the description. At last I was able to make some larger steps forward. The cockpit/gear bay assembly and the afterburner assembly get in position with the help of some quite large locating pins. All in all, everything feels and is quite solid. With the second fuselage half firmly set in position, I went around the center seam line with some Mr. Cement SP and bonded the two halves permanently. After all was set, I sawed off the piece where the spine is. That I was going to design and 3D print myself. By the time you are watching this video, the detail is already done and you can purchase the digital file from my Codes 3D shop. I will leave a link for this in the description below the video. It did not take long before I dove back into tinkering with wires and cables. Enter the snake nests that occupy the area in front of the rear instrument panel and behind his seat. Probably the hardest part of this was to figure out the actual situation. Which cables go where and how. Despite the excellent images provided in the DACO book, I was not able to fully understand this puzzle, but I did my best. To represent the various cables, I used various materials. Just like with the nose gear bay, I used copper and soldering wires. In addition to that, I used a braided line that is intended to use with beads and make bracelet or something, but I found it suitable for my intended purpose. I also repurposed the cables from a broken set of earbuds. Remember the days when those had cables. In any event, the wires that come from them are very fine and very useful. I also used several 3D printed connectors. Those not only give more realistic appearance, but also facilitate the cable's attachment. One critical aspect of this upgrade was to make sure that the seal will fit after I am done with the extra details. For this reason, I was dry fit testing almost after each new wire was installed in place. In other cases, I installed some wires while the seal was in situ. This allowed me to route the said cable more accurately within the existing cockpit details. To paint the newly created details, I had to do some masking to protect what was already painted. Not all was savable though, so it is a good thing that I spent the time weathering all those areas. To give the wires more distinct look, I mostly did dry brushing with some buff oil paint. Some got painted in the traditional way, but those were a few. I reinstated some of the lost seal weathering with the same buff oil paint dry brushing. Before I could mount the seal in place, I attached a couple of levers and did some weathering on them. The seal installation itself was not as easy as it would have been without the extra details, but with some maneuvering and persistence I managed to put it in position and glue it down. The seam between the seal and the fuselage I filled with acrylic putty. The advantage of this material is that the excess can be removed with water and Q-tip. The disadvantages are that it shrinks quite a lot and usually needs more than one application. Using a well-diluted flat black paint, I painted over the filled seam, trying to give it a worn look with somewhat irregular edges. DN models supported this build with two excellent mask sets. One of them was for the markings, but in this video I will focus on the canopy masks, which allowed me to mask the interior frames of the canopy with ease. I always prefer to paint the interior of the canopy frames, so I was happy to have the pre-cut masks. As usual, I will leave a link to DN Models website in the video description. To finish off the cockpit area, I removed the remaining bulkheads from the sprues, assembled them and applied the rubber black paint. The same paint I applied on the inside of the windshield. When painting clear parts, I do couple of layers quite dry. This way the paint will seal the edges of the mask but will not be able to leak underneath. Of course, this will not help if there is significant lifting, so I push the mask down right before I start painting. After the paint was dry, I removed the front window mask and used a ink marker to tint it. More about this technique you can find in my dedicated tutorial. Here I will say that it works wonderfully and does not alter the clarity of the transparent part at all. The bulkhead in between the canopies and the rear one got some dry brushing with neutral grey oil paint, chipping with silver pencil and buff oil paint wash to match the deck. The canopy actuator struts got painted with the silver pencil. Those look a bit subdued, so maybe there will be some silver paint highlights in the future. We'll see about that. Step 16 of the instruction booklet seems like nothing, but it takes you on a whole drilling tour de France. On top of that, there are a lot of runners to be cleaned up in this general area. Yay, fun! After drilling each hole, I deburred the exit with larger drill bit to reinstate the smooth surface. The majority of the main gear bay details are to be glued on the wing spar. The assembly itself is not more difficult than a Lego assembly. The details are good out of the box, but a few hydraulic lines and some cables will make things even better. The more prominent lines run from the gear leg pivot towards the fuselage sidewall. From the middle of the gear bay they run behind a sheet metal cover, or it looks that way. This cover is molded together with the wall out of the box. To simulate the appearance, I drilled holes on both ends. I added a few lines on the gear leg side. On the fuselage side, the bay door is designed in such a way that it is molded together with the inner bay wall, which means that I will install it quite a lot later, towards the end of the build. Fortunately, the material I used for these lines is flexible, so I will be able to mount the sidewall together with the hydraulic lines. And the other side was a copy-paste situation. There were a few ejector pin marks to be filled and sanded. After I did this, I primed the details relevant to the main gear bay and the aux doors. The crossmember I painted in interior green, which seems appropriate color for the primer. The engine section, which should be visible from the aux doors, I first painted in dark aluminum from AK. A quick wash with Tamiya's black accent color made the detail more prominent. Next up, I painted all surrounding surfaces in black to hide the walls that should not be there to begin with. Next, I did highlights on the dark aluminum with Runefang steel. That was followed by detail painting a couple of areas with transparent orange and blue for a few spots of anodized aluminum looking things. It is a very well detailed area and looks amazing with a few very simple techniques. The interior green crossmember got dry brushing with buff oil paint and a wash with Starship Field. Then I glued it in place. With that done, I was able to start assembling the center wing. First, the main spar gets glued on the bottom wing piece. I was very careful to glue every contact surface properly. With the help of some clamps, I left the assembly to cure for a while. Next, I glued the top wing parts, again being very careful to attend all joints. With some more clamping, I am pretty sure all is buttoned up well. I glued down the small piece that finishes up the bottom section, and with that done, it was time to assemble the airframe together. Just like with the fuselage halves assembly, here I was treated with sizable locating pins and other forms of aid. I got small seam line gaps right behind the flaps, but that was most likely user-induced error. The section that fits over the nose gear bay is just magic. So nice. I'm not going to hide it, I very much like what I see. And the journey here was amazing. There is still a lot to be done, but in any event this is a milestone. And with that I think we can end today's episode. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, happy modeling fellas.